Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Some of you are with us in the middle of the night, and bravo! Thank you for attending. My name is Margie Mendel, and I'm the director of the Carl Polanyi Institute at Concordia University in Montreal. Second webinar on this topic, on democratizing work, a conversation on the lessons of the current pandemic. We held one yesterday in French. Both of these will be, or yesterday's was recorded, today's will be recorded as well. So you can consult these after, or if you want to return to specific discussions and hear them again, they'll be available. And in that regard, if anyone does not want their image to be seen as these are being filmed, please just turn off your video screen and you will be invisible. Also, please turn off your microphone now so we don't have any interference throughout the event. As far as questions and comments are concerned, you can enter these in the chat box in writing, and we will do our best to field. Actually, yesterday we did not have to field the questions. Our speakers were incredibly agile and were able to speak and react to questions at the same time. So we'll see how it goes. Both of these webinars together had as their objective what we felt was really the imperative to engage in a dialogue between the authors of the manifesto that has attracted so much attention. It was signed by, I believe, approximately 6,000 researchers across all continents, across all disciplines. It appeared in 47 languages. And in close to 30 newspapers around the world. These figures keep changing, but they keep going up. So if anything, I might be underestimating them. And this just demonstrates how important, how relevant, how pertinent the issues raised in this manifesto are. The objective, we are the Carl Polanyi Institute. We are the Inter-University Research Center on Globalization and Work at the University of Montreal, as well as Industry 4.0, Work and Employment Axis of the International Observatory on the Societal Impacts of AI and Digital Technologies, that have co-hosted or are co-hosting these two events. Today, we're delighted to have two of the three authors of the manifesto with us. Isabel Ferraras, welcome back. She was with us yesterday as well. Professor of Sociology, Université Catholique de Louvain, and Julie Batilana, Professor, Harvard Business School, and Professor of Social Innovation at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Dominique Méda, Université de Paris Dauphine, was with us yesterday. She is the third author of the manifesto, as was Adele Blackett from McGill University, who is a collaborator as the manifesto expanded its collaborators and went forward with the ideas that were originally published. I'd also like to inform you that Édition Seuil in Paris just published Le Manifeste Travail démocratisé, démarchandisé et dépollué, edited, there it is, by Isabelle, Julie, and Dominique. It is now available in Canada, here in Quebec, and we await an English edition with great impatience, and maybe 27 language editions, who knows. So I would, in light of our objective to generate a conversation between authors and representatives of workers' movement, labor movement, unions, worker cooperatives, civil society organizations, and academic or researchers who are affiliated with these respective movements and organizations. We wish to thank Andrew Jackson, former Director of Social and Economic Policy at the Canadian Labour Congress, and currently Senior Policy Advisor, Broadbent Institute, Ottawa. Esteban Kelly, Executive Director of the U.S. Federation of Cooperatives, and worker owner and co-founder of Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance, Lana Payne, Secretary-Treasurer of Unifor, and Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Center for Future Work. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to comment on the resonance of the manifesto with the challenges and objectives of your respective organizations. There's much more biographical information available on the announcement of the event. You can consult that afterwards. The next hour and a half will be moderated by my colleague, my friend, and co-organizer Gregor Murray, who is the director of the Inter-University Research Center on Globalization and Work. And before we begin, I'd also like to thank Portier and Nicolas Roby of CRIMT and Anna Gomez of the Polanyi Institute for their excellent and invaluable logistical, technical, and communication support. Again, please turn off your microphones and your videos if you do not wish to be recorded. And I wish you all an excellent conversation. And I turn it over to you now, Greg.
Okay, thank you very much, Margie Mindell, who's done a terrific job on this. And as you might believe, when the Carl Polanyi Institute is co-hosting an activity on de-commodification, Polanyi rests happy wherever he is watching us. So yeah, I also want to just shout out for Industry for Work and Employment that Margie and I are both involved in this initiative, and we have Christian Levesque somewhere in the background here on the screen, possibly Jacqueline Corbett, who was there yesterday, Lise Langlois, who's director of Ovia. So just to acknowledge their presence. How do we want to start? Yesterday, Julie, and I'm not sure what it should be, Julie or Julie, but we're in Quebec, so it would be Julie.
Julie works for me.
Perfect. Dominique Mehta essentially told us that she was minding her own business, and then Isabel called her and said, "This is what we're going to do." Is that true? Because we know that reality is constructed from different subjectivities, and that just might have been Dominique's view, but you're going to tell us a different tale. How did you come to be involved in this initiative?
So not only it's true, but that's always how it works with Isabel. Like, you know, you're doing your own business, and then you're getting an email from Isabel, an article, an invitation, and then you realize that you were not doing what you were supposed to do, and what you should do is join forces so that we can do more together. So I was myself working on a paper and on a book on a Saturday morning when I got an email from Isabel and Dominique telling me, "Hey, here is a piece we wrote. What do you think? Would you want to join us?" And I have to say, shame on me for that. I was writing this book on power, and I said to myself, well, what should I do? Should I spend the day working on that? Fortunately, I did. And then I sent them a document back with all of my revisions, and then said, hey, up to you. If you don't agree, move forward. But I sort of included what I wanted to include and made the changes I wanted to make. And then they both wrote back and said, let's move forward. So it's what Dominique said is very aligned with my own experience too.
Okay, so thank you. Julie, and just so everyone knows, we're going to do about half an hour of back and forth with the authors of the manifesto, filling in some background, and then we'll bring in our commentators from the labor movement, and we're going to do some ice-breaking questions, and then each will deliver a series of reflections. It's all going to be very frustrating for everyone because they have not enough time to say everything that they want to say. But the idea is to get the conversation started. So if that works, and then in the meantime, people can be making comments, asking questions on the chat. We're not going to activate because of the number of participants to actually ask questions, but we're going to pick up the questions and get people to respond. And in the end, everyone from both the discussants and the initial authors should have an opportunity to say something at the end. So that's where we're heading. Now, Isabel, we have basically concordance on the stories of how this initiative came about, but what we need to know is why and how. and why then? So
Yeah.
where does the idea, before actually saying what's in the manifesto, but just talking a bit about its inception?
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you first for having us, Margie and Gregor and all the team in Canada. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for all the guests that you have invited to join us to exchange on these important ideas, especially in this crisis. So why did we engage into this? Well, first, we did not know we were engaging into something else than just writing an op-ed. So that was just the idea at the time. It was the month of April. It was a lockdown time in Paris, in Brussels, and in Boston. And we felt that as scientists working on workers, on the economic life, on firms, on organizations, we had to do something to help workers face this period, in the sense that we felt so grateful to those, especially the essential workers who were not, confined in their homes as we were, but to the cashiers, to the bikers delivering food, to the nurses, all the people who could not be in their homes, but who would be on the front line. And we felt we had to just step in to say what we think we have learned from our own research and from the research of so many others and important thinkers that came before us, as Karl Polanyi.
And Isabel, one of the unique aspects of this manifesto, it's a manifesto written by women, and the initial core was a group of women scholars, and then branching out in concentric circles and ever more inclusive. But why was that important, and how has it evolved over time?
That's a great question. We indeed felt it was particularly important, given that what we felt and experienced at the time, to reflect in our way to act as scholars the importance that women have, the huge burden that women have taken over their shoulders during the lockdown time in particular. And so we really felt that as female scholars, we could maybe highlight that by first reaching out to our female colleagues who have an expertise on these questions, but because they are women, also sometimes are not so much to the forefront. And so actually the stories that as we finished our piece, we reached out to Le Monde, to our to the journalist who's we have the three of us happen to have the same contact, Antoine Revachon, who's in charge of the ideas page of the economic section of Le Monde, and Antoine actually gave us the green light to publish the op-ed, but told us that he would not be able to publish it on May Day, but that it would he would be able to publish on May the 60th. The 16th, because there was a special issue on life after lockdown. And so we had those 2 weeks during which we thought that it was important to make sure that other people in the academic world would validate these three principles that we think we have to learn from this crisis. But again, these principles are not new. This is a new occasion to learn about them. And what was very striking is that as we reached to our colleagues, and first the female colleagues, but very quickly to also male colleagues, because obviously this is not against men, it's really about fighting together to sustain the position of workers in this society. We got, as you said, thousands of people thousands of scholars signing around the globe.
And just on that point, Isabelle, and then I'll move over to you, Julie. Black lives matter, and in Canada we often say Black and Indigenous lives matter. It was about to have a huge resurgence in the U.S. because of the death of Mr. Floyd, but I think that you had an initial extension on intersectionality in the way that you were thinking about the manifesto. Is that the case?
Yes, absolutely. So this was obviously before the tragic death of George Floyd, but we immediately as we started to circulate the text to our first circle, let's say of collaborators in academia, we received the feedback from Adele Blackett, who was with us yesterday. Adele told us, you're typically laying out ideas as these French universalists who think that because they are, speaking about the worker and those big universalist categories, that they speak for actually everyone. And she really urged us to make sure that we were properly understood, that we indeed are speaking in universal terms, but about specific lives, and that there are some people who are actually paying a much bigger tribute than others, and especially in this pandemic, the Black community serving others and being working at those jobs which are not so protected than others. So we really made sure in the manifesto that that was made very explicit, and we could have actually do even more, but we were very concerned not to be misunderstood.
Okay, thank you. And Julie, this is a what question, and it's really for people who might be signing on to this webinar and not have a clue what the manifesto was about. So if you did your best 1 or 1.5 minute summary of saying, this is what it is, before we actually get into the thick of the arguments developed in and around the manifesto and the subsequent book that you've co-edited, co-authored, can you say here, what is the manifesto?
Sure. So thank you, Gregor, and thank you everyone for joining. I think we should go back to the question we were asking ourselves with Isabelle and Dominique when we got together in the spring and we wrote the op-ed. And the question to us was, what can we learn from this crisis? And our answer was a clear answer, which is that what we can learn from this crisis, relearn what this crisis is reminding us of, is that workers are so much more than resources. They're just not the mere commodity, they're not a resource. We've been talking about essential workers, and yet there is a gap between the term that's so well deserved and the reality of what's happening in our society, and the fact that we are not recognizing these workers as well as we should. We're not recognizing their contributions as well as we should. So our idea was to say that what we had to do was to really, put human beings and our planet back at the heart of our economic system. And as we thought about how to do that, that led us to articulate the 3 principles manifesto, because our thinking was around work and how to rethink work and reform our approach to work. And what we're suggesting is that we now need to democratize work, right? Which is to really give a real say and real power in the decision making to workers. That's number 1. Then de-commodify work, and this is where we're building on the shoulders, obviously, of Karl Polanyi. And that's absolutely critical. Work is a right, and it's not a mere commodity. And then finally, remediate the environment. And I'd like to insist on what Isabelle just said, which is these principles are not novel, and we're very aware of that. But what we think is critical today is to understand that these principles are tightly connected to each other. If we want to remediate the environment, and based on the science, we have no choice. We have to, if we want to survive as a species, and if we want to save the other species on this planet, if we want to remediate the environment, save our planet, we will need to democratize, we will need to de-commodify. And that's what we are articulating in the manifesto and really further developing in the book.
Super. Thank you, Judy. And you're now beginning to see the logic unfold of the the reason why we have Lana Payne and Estevan Kelly, Andrew Jackson, and Jim Stanford to comment, because then it comes full circle. The ideas are going to be tested, and you're going to be asked how they can be developed, or they're going to tell us and suggest how we might think about their development. So let's drill down on the three core pillars of the manifesto. And I think it's Isabelle first, but you can tell me if it should be Julie. Isabelle, why start with democratize? And what's the argument that you're making around democratization, recalling that it's democratization, de-commodification, and remediation or depollution, or
saving the planet.
Yeah, saving the planet. That's the best expression.
But yeah, well, about the first principle, in a nutshell, the idea is that if we take seriously the idea that Julie just reminded us, that workers are not mere commodities, that they are actually people, real people, we might want to identify them as labor investors to the firms, to the organizations in which they work. We absolutely need to start thinking seriously about how they can be citizens in the workplace as well as they are in the larger public sphere. And the principle that we affirm here is that if workers are essential, if we want to recognize the value of workers, the fact that our societies, if they are resilient at all, it is because of workers, well, then we need to give them a real right to actually validate or veto the decisions of the firms, not only to which they belong, but actually that they make. That the idea is that without workers, without labor investors, there would be no firm at all. So you might have a pile of money, but that money would not produce anything, any good, any service, any production, and any fruit. So the first principle we affirm is this collective right for workers to actually validate or veto the decisions at the firm level, and that require, obviously, a major change in the distribution of power at the firm level.
Is that and two kind of sub questions here, Isabelle. First, many participants here in North America, so we don't have the pedestal of Belgian and German co-determination, no matter what criticism we might want to make about the degree to which it actually achieves what you're suggesting. But in other circumstances, if you can't be unionized and put it in your collective agreement, and those are already two big steps, good luck. So that's an issue which we could be raised. What's your response to that in terms of the arguments you're making?
We don't think actually that either the Belgian system or the German Mitbestimmung system is actually there yet in terms of democracy at work. These are important steps, obviously, but it's clear that today the only democratic firms that we know on the face of the earth are worker cooperatives. These are this probably we could call democratic firms, meaning that these are firms where workers collectively govern themselves. And so the idea here is to take seriously an intuition that is already at the heart of industrial relations systems, and specifically the invention of collective bargaining, is the idea that workers should have a collective voice to bear on the conditions that apply to them. And so indeed, we can call that idea the bicameral principle, is the idea that collectively workers at the firm level would have a right that is today the right that actually the board enjoy, which is the right to collectively position itself on the strategy of the firm. And the proposition here is to recognize to workers collectively the same ability, the same right as that right that is already recognized to the board. Yeah.
And I'll just say in a little parenthesis there that if people are interested in knowing more about this, Isabel a couple of years ago published a book with Cambridge University Press entitled "The Firm as Political Entity." I hope I've got that exactly right. And he makes these arguments in a very compelling way about it's not unlike the entry of Parliament relative to monarchical power, that we're still at this phase with firms, and we need to think this through. Another aspect, and the other sub-question I want to ask you before passing it over to Julie, is we're in an era of digital transformations, and I would be remiss not to raise this with the participation of Industry 4, Work Employment, OVIA. We're all focused on technological changes, and it seems to be that you're making the argument about the governance of these transformations, and that's by and large absent in many of the discussions about technology. And when you say governance, what you're really talking about are democratic rights. Now, that's a question rather than a statement, but I think that there are some ideas that we share here.
Yes, absolutely. I think the stakes are very high as we enter into this phase of development of the economy, where automation, artificial intelligence are kicking in, and it's really the time not to let those decisions into the hands of financial investors only. It's really decisions that are so consequential to workers that they absolutely need to be at the table of decision to bear on these decisions. And we can also, if I can just make an input here on, because on gig workers, this is also a discussion that's very relevant to gig workers and the whole platform economy, because our vision, our way to define what is a firm is actually the key question at the heart of the development of the gig economy. And when we think in terms of labor investors, we can actually enter a world into we recognize that these Uber drivers, for instance, are actually the labor investors into the Uber firm, where actually all we recognize is the Uber corporation. The Uber corporation is has entered the stock market, but actually last year, if the people who were buying shares, acquiring those Uber corporation shares, they would never have put a single dollar into those shares if it were not for knowing that there would be drivers, actual person, labor investors, drive their own, deliver the service. And so it's a fiction that we accept that the firm is actually reduced to the corporation. But no, the firm is made of obviously a capitalist investment in a capitalist economy, but is made of those labor investors too. And these people, they should have absolutely a say on the government of what is actually a joint endeavor to be monopolized by the capital investors.
Okay, and Julie, you'll see that this is a absolutely natural segue into the second pillar of the manifesto, which is de-commodification. So tell us about that and why it's important, and what your thinking is on this second pillar of the manifesto.
It is indeed very important. So de-commodifying, as we've been saying, really means ensuring everyone's right to work. And so this is important because what we want to highlight here is that we cannot and we must not, in fact, let the so-called labor market decide our future and our destiny. The market is neither neutral nor fair. If the market were neutral or fair, we would know it. It's characterized by biases and imperfections, and it favors some of us and disadvantages others. And when we leave it to the market to decide for us, basically what we do is that we let those who have the most power on that market decide. And so we were talking about racialized minorities, and I would say for women and racialized minorities, look at their example, right? They are sadly a good example of the dangers of letting the so-called labor market decide for us. Both groups have, if you look back in history, been barred from accessing the labor market, and they are still valued less through unequal compensation today. So all that to say that obviously we have to fight these inequalities, and we must fight the biases, but what we must also do is things, and that's what we say in the manifesto and in the book. We must recognize that there are collective needs and sectors that have to be protected from the sole law of markets, from the sole logic of pure profitability, because if we don't protect them, and I'm thinking about healthcare, I'm thinking about education, if we don't protect these sectors, then, and that's what we've experienced in the United States over the time of this terrible pandemic crisis, then inequalities rise, and this is highly problematic. But decommodifying, and that's what I want to insist on, decommodifying labor goes beyond protecting some sectors of the economy. What we also have to do is recognize the fact that work is not a commodity, it is a human right, and it is a human right that's actually recognized by the Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I put emphasis on that because I got to realize that it's not something that people necessarily know. It is already regarded as a human right. Now, the question obviously we're having, and it's a very legitimate question, is, okay, like we can follow this whole reasoning, but now how are you going to make that happen concretely? Can you tell us about what we can do? And so decommodifying labor really means guaranteeing access to a job for everyone who desires it. And so the thing is that we at the moment have enough social and environmental problems around us to make sure that those who want to contribute and participate, well, will have an opportunity to do so. It's about thinking about the matching, about the labor and the job and the people who want to contribute. And so again, here we were talking earlier about co-determination and existing systems related to democratization. The good news is that we also have existing job guarantee programs that are being developed and experimented with across the world as we speak, that are opening the way and paving the way for us to think about how to scale such job guarantee programs. And as I speak, I have it with me here. See, I have well surrounded. I have sort of Carl Polanyi and the Great Transformation as I talk about decommodifying work. And I also have the book by Pavlina Chernova on the job guarantee. Pavlina is a co-author, a contributor to the book, and she's just published a book that's all about this job guarantee. And I think that we need to look more into these initiatives, better understand how to scale them, because that's going to be a necessity if we want to remediate the environment.
And I'm sure, just a sub-question here, Judy, some people, hackles will be raised, not necessarily with job guarantee, but their experience of job guarantee is one of forced labor. In other words, you don't have any social welfare unless you do some crappy job that no one else wants to do.
No, and this is absolutely critical. You know, the example I have in mind as I'm talking about this job guarantee at the moment is the French example that some of you may be aware of. So if you look at what has happened in France, we've been using this experiment of the long-term zero employment territories. And so what we've done in those territories, it used to be only 10, now it's going to be scaled to 60 regions, is that a new kind of companies have been created. And these companies are created to hire people who've been unemployed. No one is to say, if you are though looking for employment in one of those regions and you want to join a company and find a way to contribute, then this company's purpose is to hire you and then work with you and all of the other employees so that we can together think about what the companies could offer in terms of product services, right? So that people can be employed and they can also address the needs of the communities. Importantly, and this is another point, as they're doing that work, they're careful not to take jobs away from existing for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. Now, even more interesting, if you look at then the kind of jobs that they end up creating and what people who work for these organizations do, well, they end up working on a lot of activities that are about remediating the environment and helping the communities locally preserve their local ecosystems.
And just before I use that as another segue into the third pillar, I just wanted to ask you, and this can be a very quick response, has the COVID been a key factor in moving forward our thinking about decommodification, or are we in a prelude to a new intensive wave of neoliberalization?
I think it's such a critical moment. We can stay the course and just continue with the same neoliberal model that has been dominant. If we do, two things will happen, and we know what they are, and this is not ideological, it's documented by research. We will further increase inequalities, number one, and we will further destroy our planet. So to me, the choice is a clear one. And so from that standpoint, when we now think about the alternative model and the role of decommodifying during this crisis, this pandemic, as you're saying, the rates of unemployment are sadly skyrocketing across the world. So it's going to be more important than ever for us to think about the kind of system we want for tomorrow. And if we want a more democratic, a fairer, and a greener society, we will have to decommodify, because we will have to support the workers. We will have to operate a transition from industries where they lost their jobs, as well as polluting industries, because we'll want them to transition to greener industries. But that's not going to happen miraculously. And I know Dominique was with you yesterday. I'm sure she talked about that. We have to help them in the transition. And to help them in the transition, we need these job guarantee programs because they need the security, and we also need to boost their self-esteem. We as a society should be grateful for what these people will be doing, because they will help us preserve our ecosystems.
Okay, thank you. And Isabel, I'd like to move over to the third pillar, but just beforehand, I want to give a shout out to Lana Payne, because once we move from the third pillar, we're going to go into our set of comments coming from our labor movement activists, representatives, officials. So just so Lana knows that she'll be coming up in the not too distant future, and then we'll move over to Esteban after that. So Isabel, bring in the third pillar. And of course, both of you have spoken about saving the planet and its critical aspect, but just flush it out a bit for us.
Well, I think Julie has already beautifully started to flesh it, because indeed there is this aspect of work that is going to be needed to actually remediate the planet, because we know that the planet is going to be is already impacted by by climate change, and so that will require us to take care of the planet, and that requires work that needs to be performed, and indeed the market is not going necessarily to take care of that. But it also the recognition that actually the capitalist economic system is fundamentally an extractive model. So it is the design of the firm is really about producing more return, more profits for those who inject capital in it. So it's an extractive model that works at the expense of workers and of the planet. And so we've been very inspired by that, the work done by engineers at the University of Cambridge. They published in 2011 an important piece of research in which they actually showed that 73% consumption of energy at the global level could be saved if we would adapt our production processes. But what they highlight is that we actually already have the technology needed to make those adaptations, but what is needed is human labor. But if we leave the government of firms in the hands of those who bring capital into it, obviously they are not the ones who are going to care for bringing in more human labor. So in terms of the internal dynamic of the economic units, if you want, we absolutely need to redress the imbalance of power so that workers have the real possibility to bear on the choices of firms, so that they can make sure that more labor is put in, so that the limits of the planet are respected. That said, we certainly in the manifesto, we say that global norms at the global level ideally, but regional level could do also absolutely an important bit of work, should be imposed by states. So we are not dreaming that firms left to their own devices are going to be all of a sudden totally capable to care for planetary boundaries. But if we set a proper international setting which sets the proper limits of the economic activity, we certainly want to make sure that these adjustments at the firm level, and it's the same thing as vis-a-vis the automation and the artificial intelligence challenge, that these decisions are not going to be made by capital investors only, but by labor investors as well, so that they can be fair.
Okay, I thank you, Isabel. I think that we're just about ready to move over to our labor worker representatives. So we'll ask Lana to activate her camera. But Isabel, we had a very practical question yesterday. Can one still sign the manifesto? That was the first question that I had. A second question was, I'm not a highfalutin university worker. Do you still want my signature? And of course, my answers were yes, but please affirm and indicate.
Absolutely. No, you're right. Yesterday, we were so much in the content that we actually forgot to mention that, yes, at the beginning, it was coming from the academic community, but once it was published, we indeed actually opened it to signature, not only to individual from fields, but also from organizations. So there are already quite a bit of a few unions, for instance, who have actually endorsed the manifesto. I put in the chat our webpage, democratizingwork.org, and there you have the text in many languages, and you can sign it. And please, if you feel like this is resonant, share it, consider signing it as an individual, but also as an organization.
Okay, thank you, Isabel. That's terrific. I think we got a good basis now to move over to the second part of the discussion, which is a series of comments. I'm first going to do an icebreaker question, Lena, so you don't have to go fully into your comments, and just tell us what your day job is, where you are physically, and maybe make the link with a group of workers who we would all consider essential, who are currently, unless it's been settled, who are currently an absolute manifestation and representation of the kind of issues brought about by COVID-19 for workers and their families.
Yes, so my day job is as the National Secretary Treasurer of Unifor, which is Canada's largest private sector union, although we do have many public sector workers as well that we represent, over 315,000 workers from coast to coast to coast. And obviously within that, the finances of the union are my primary responsibility, but also I deal with many other issues, collective bargaining. We just had a very successful round of collective bargaining and auto negotiations, which speaks really well, I think, to a number of these issues here. And we were very successful in negotiating the shift from gasoline-fueled vehicles to EVs, and getting investment and changing the makeup of many of our auto factories in Canada over the span of the next years. These are the kinds of things where we can, if we have the power of a union at work, that you can really have impact on the kinds of investments that firms will make if you use your collective bargaining power that way. In addition, we've just had a dispute of 1,400 essential workers across my home province of Newfoundland and Labrador, the most easterly province in Canada, and this was a fight about decent work. So very much what our sisters are talking about here, a decent pay. They were workers who were always considered not essential until we get into a moment like this crisis and everybody in the world realizes how important grocery workers were and warehouse workers in that distribution and supply chain were to the world. We could have not survived without them. And it really, I think, shone a light, if you will, on this exact problem that we have, that this crisis has exposed the profound problems that we have had in the world, or at least re-exposed. And I think this has been very clear from this panel discussion that we must, in some ways, use the moment of this crisis as an opportunity to make the world better for essential workers, but to do the 3 planks that have been outlined in this manifesto. The job for these workers is not done. You can't. It can't be fixed over many elements that impact these workers, not the least of which is the legislative framework, et cetera, Gregor, in terms of all of the things that need to change. I do believe that there has been, I guess, more of a recognition right now in the country that things have to change for workers in these categories, and very often has been pointed out, it is racialized workers doing these jobs.
And Len, I just want to check that you're not morphing into your full comments.
No,
but more than welcome to. But just before you do that, and this is the union leader. You look at something like the manifesto and you say, oh my goodness, they're up in the clouds, or really, I see such strong connections that this is good. And of course, your comments are going to develop this, but just your initial reaction.
Well, I think that it is not up in the clouds. I think these are the 3 things that unions are dealing with on a basis. How do we make work better for working people? And when I get into my comments, I will say that this is the fundamental premise of how we create democracy. You must first do it at work. And one of the ways you do that is to have mass unionization across all sectors of the economy. And I would say that when you look at the issue of how do we remediate, how do we do all of these kinds of things, you can't do that if you're not first having this conversation with working people. And very often we have terms thrown out there such as just transition, when what a worker's experience would be is that there's been no transition for them in the history of work that has ever been just for working people. So how do we that? And I think that this crisis is giving us an opportunity to really hammer home, the kinds of changes that need to be made, not just around workers' rights and union rights, but the other elements that have been raised here in the manifesto. And as I'm so glad to see that it was written by women, which is a very, very good thing. And so as a woman on this panel, I would say I would add a little preamble to your manifesto, which basically would recognize that unions at work are the foundation of how we create democracy at work.
I think that we're ready to start your full 5-minute contribution, and I would that it could be much longer. But give us your reaction to the manifesto in the light of your own experience and that of the members that you represent and Unifor, for which you're a leader.
Great, thanks. And Murray, please feel free to cut me off if I go over my 5 minutes. Okay, great. I'm sure you will. So as I add that little preamble to the manifesto that basically recognizes that workplace democracy starts with having a union at work, and really what would workplace democracy mean for working people. And that for us and what we try to push home every single day is basically being able to have a say in your workplace, in how that workplace is run, your ability to negotiate or have a voice in terms of what the health and safety conditions are like, what your pay is like, and really then amplifying all of that so that you move and shift that kind of a voice out into the broader community. And that to me becomes the difference between just straight up unionism and what I would call social unionism, which is the kind of unionism that our union practices. The other thing I would say is that we can't have full democracy at work if we don't have a proper legislative framework for this to occur. I think what we're seeing all across the world, and I was so glad to see both panelists talk about this, is the workplace is changing. It's changing dramatically, and the push from multinational corporations that we are seeing this commodification of working people. And so in response to that, I would say what we need to see are stronger union rights. Right now, if you look at gig workers, contract workers, there really is no floor in terms of labor standards anymore, because these corporations have had so much power in terms of getting around all of this. We might have called this manifesto that capitalism just doesn't work for working people, and I think that that's very clear that it hasn't. But even if we woke up tomorrow and we had all of the union rights that we needed, we had paid sick days for working people during this pandemic. We were managed to have a structural and sectoral bargaining for people in low-paid sectors, whether it was retail, et cetera, so that you're lifting up all of these workers. We wouldn't stop pushing to democratize work, because I think what we see in our union is the need to organize over and over again, not to just keep what you have, but to be able to push forward. I often use this expression with equality for women, that the moment, unless all women have equality, none of us really do, because the gains we've made are so much at risk. And I think that this is true of unionized workers as well. All of the gains that we have made and the ones that we have fought for broader in society for working people, these things are at risk when we have millions of workers around the globe who are nowhere near having these kinds of rights. So the need, I would say, to start with unionization at work is critical to how we can actually achieve all of these other things. I think that's my 5 minutes, Gregor.
That's discipline like a microphone with a red and yellow light on the convention floor. Alana, that's under the 5 minutes, but we hope to hear from you again. I'm going to then pass it over to Esteban, who will need to activate his microphone. I'm going more, Andrew, in the relation to how I see the images on the screen. So we whether it's Esteban first or you, we'll go to Esteban, and thank you for being with us, Esteban. And I'll first ask as an icebreaker before we go into actual comments, let's co-ops can sometimes be seen as the poor second cousin of the labor movement, right? With no aspersion, and has in a sense COVID up the game and opened the possibility of saying, hey, this is part of our economic future, so that it's in some sense it's been an opportunity for you because of the devastating impact of the pandemic on so many businesses and on their viability.
Well, hello. It's good. It's good to be here. Thanks again for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I really appreciate it. I would say that's a new one to me. I don't know. I think I've heard of worker centers and other kinds of alt labor groups like the Freelancers Union, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, in the U.S. the National Domestic Worker, as much more of a sort of cousin or half a step removed relation to unions as organized labor. But I think, first of all, it's important to recognize that these are all forms of organized labor. I think we do ourselves a massive disservice by not recognizing it as such. I still remember the moment, and it was only a handful of years ago, where I sat down at a retreat with our board of directors, and they're, of course, 100% democratically elected out of our grassroots membership base, by the membership base, and said, you guys, you realize that we're an alternative form of organized labor. oh my God, like that's so true. And I don't know why I'm having a light bulb moment, but I had never seen us that way. And I'm like, and you're the leadership of this. So we have some work to do to even start to see ourselves and to recognize our own power, and what that means for the kinds of strategies, coalitions, and alliances we're building when we talk about organized labor, when we talk about being in solidarity, whether it's with employee ownership forms, whether it's with unions, whether it's with worker-owned cooperatives, or just some of the other ways that people are organizing, including in informal types of work and the gig and freelance economy, which is another area that we're starting to organize in. So I think with all of that as my sort of caveat about it, yes, absolutely, we're another form of organized labor. Specifically in the US, we share a common ancestor, right? And so labor unions and worker cooperatives grew out of the same organizing effort in the middle of the 19th century. And it wasn't until the Knights of Labor kind of split off and the AFL and the CIO, which now are joined as the AFL-CIO, those are all permutations of what was a common movement. And I think that that's important to understand and spend a little more time in that history, which I'm not doing in my comments. I'm just sort of signaling that that's useful to the extent that this manifesto has sparked curiosity about people around workplace democracy, around worker ownership, about the power, the potential collective power of organized labor. Dig into it. There's some really interesting history about, like, this is not new, and we're not new on the scene. That we're actually the solidarity is not just rhetorical. It actually goes back historically into the history of all sort of modern industrial labor and how it has been organized historically, especially in the West. So
thank you for meeting that inclusion challenge so eloquently. And there are many inclusion challenges, of course. But why don't we ask you then to say, okay, Esteban, you might not have known about this manifesto. You might have known about it, but you've now had a chance to think about it in the light of your own experience. So, what kind of comments would you like to make?
A couple things. As you can tell, it sparked a lot for me, and I think it's exciting, and it provides an opportunity for us to have a rich conversation and to connect some dots that I think have needed to be connected for a while. The first thing that I want to speak to is the first pillar of it around democratizing work and labor, and I think the piece I want to lift up, especially from a worker co-op perspective, and of course I'm both a worker owner in my cooperative that I founded, and have been a worker owner in other cooperatives in different industries and sectors, and then I'm also, the director of our worker co-op federation in the U.S. And a board member with the International Worker Co-op Association. So some of this is informed by that, and I think that we need to go a little bit deeper in our understanding of what is the power of worker ownership and workplace democracy. That it's not simply representation, like, great, we have a seat at the table, or we have 2% of the votes or whatever. And it's not simply about voice and participation in process. All of those things are there, and they're important. But I think what workplace democracy gets us, especially in its purest form, which I appreciate you all lifting up as worker cooperatives as one of the purest forms of ownership and control, is that it gives the workforce, it gives the workers themselves agency in shaping what we do, how we tap into or unlock the power of this collective asset, the asset of owning a business, right? We understand the power of businesses generally, everyone in the world, right? Whether you're anti-capitalist, pro-capitalist, you understand that an enterprise, a firm, whether it's small or large, is incredibly potent. And it turns out that we've greased the wheels for enterprises to have much more freedom actually than people, let alone workers. like the freest expression, all of the incentives, whether it's tax breaks, representation for even in representative democracies to your representatives in Parliament or Congress, all of that is tilted toward firms and corporations. So already there's something that's very powerful about what it looks like to lean into that with a different set of values. That's not saying let's abolish all firms and business. It is saying that there's something that's powerful about the circumstances we find ourselves in, including the potential of working the market, like that market forces, that capital flows, that productive power, even the adaptivity of businesses are all really powerful in the 21st century economy. So when we talk about worker ownership, it now means that unlike simply the matter of having land or owning an asset like a home or even a vehicle or something like that, that owning a business sets you up as workers to meet your needs in a lot of different ways, that you actually get to not just make a decision about how you're doing what you're set out to do initially, but when and how you might need to make pivots or shift the core purpose of your business. If you're in tough times, and you mentioned COVID as an example of this, it's not a matter of saying we're either open or we're closed, like that there's one business plan, or we set out to be a taxi service, and the market has bottomed out on that, and people are staying home and quarantining, so we're just shutting down and firing everybody. You can actually do what a lot of our members did and say, oh, we're actually going to become an essential service. We're going to fill in some of the gaps right now. We're going to take people to grocery stores. We're going to take people to the polls to vote. We're going to take nurses who are doing home-based healthcare or assisted living. That there's all kinds of different ways to shift and operate how you show up in solidarity with the needs of our communities, or how you address whether cuts need to be made if you are going to take furloughs, if you're going to jack up the prices of certain things, if you're going to take a voluntary pay cut, if you're going to just forego, that extra staff retreat, or what are those other options that you have. Workplace democracy means that the line of the distance and the line of chain of command or line of communication between the most frontline worker and a board member or a manager, somebody who's a decision maker, is all shrunken down, so that the very people who are experiencing the opportunities or the problems are at the table and are the ones who are shaping what needs to happen, including what needs to happen for themselves as workers in and of themselves. Maybe I'll save the other things I was going to say for discussion.
That's terrific discipline, Esteban, and we will open it up to further discussion. I do also want to remind people that there's a chat function, so if you want to raise questions or make comments, you can begin to do this at the same time as we invite our next two discussants, the first of whom will be Andrew Jackson. And just as an icebreaker, Andrew, before I actually invite your full-blown comments, here you've been Director of Research and Economics at the Canadian Labour Congress. You've been a Packer Professor of Social Justice. You're a Senior Advisor at the Broadbent Institute, along with an observation of state social policy. And I just want to ask you right off the top, I just want to ask you right off the top, if we've made more progress in state social policies in the last 8 months, at least in Canada, than we have in preceding decades, or this is an illusion and it could all disappear in the whiff of a calling of debt from whatever set of financiers you want to have call in debt.
Well, as to whether the pandemic has changed things for the better, I think that's very much an open question. I think there's no doubt the income support during the pandemic and the massive holes in the EI system, unemployment insurance system, that were revealed, and the need to respond to that in the short term. We've certainly seen the government sort of respond to the sudden surge in need for income support. And we're now into a debate about how to reform the unemployment insurance system, which could lead to permanent changes. But I mean, I think it all comes down to political pressure and whether we can sort of transform existing programs. There's no doubt. I think the pandemic income benefits have created a lot of interest around social and income policy alternatives. Has sort of reignited the basic income debate to a degree, which I'm somewhat skeptical about, or at least would like to contextualize more. I think we're likely to see a permanent expansion of public and social services in the sense of caring services in Canada, particularly elder care. It's unbelievable to me that we'd simply go back to the status quo ante when the massive holes in the system have been revealed so blightingly. But you know, it will come down, as all things, to political struggle.
Okay, so that's probably the ideal opening for the comments that you want to make about the manifesto. So over to you.
Well, I wanted to hone in on the job guarantee concept. I'll just preface that by saying there's an enormous amount in the statement that I agree with and heartily endorse. I guess when it comes to de-commodification of labor, I've been around a long time and I'm perhaps a bit simple-minded. But I think there's a classic way of looking at these issues on the left that it's important to be explicit about our relationship to. The first one is macroeconomic policies of full employment. If we're talking about building worker power in political space, in workplaces, in policy debates, then I think low unemployment is an absolute precondition for ultimately building a strong labor movement, increasing the power of workers. Without going too far into it, I would stress with Danny Roderick and others that if we're going to go back to a full employment macroeconomic policy, we need to challenge the mobility of capital globally, think about capital controls. If you go back to Keynes and Polanyi, they always thought if societies were going to be able to make real choices, for instance, about the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, taxation levels, what to spend money on, low unemployment was an absolute precondition. And I bracket that to good unemployment insurance programs that provide income support during periods of involuntary unemployment. I think what's sometimes forgotten is that an awful lot of unemployment is still frictional workers moving between jobs. I think workers who become unemployed need to search for a job in the labor market that suits their skills and qualifications, not just be forced to take any job. So that right to unemployment compensation, I think, is hugely important. So where does a job guarantee fit in? I mean, I endorse the idea in the sense that every worker should have the right to a job to be achieved through a range of policies. Going back, I think the idea of a job guarantee went back to Hyman Minsky. And the issue for him was, what do you do if you get low levels of unemployment but still persistent unemployment? And Minsky thought governments should create jobs directly to deal with so-called structural unemployment. And I think in that tradition, we've long called for active labor market policies to help workers left behind. I think the problem with some renditions of a job guarantee, I don't think this is particularly true of the manifesto, it alludes to the idea rather than details, but a lot of seem to envisage turning on and off public and environmental green jobs on and off like a fire hose, depending on the overall state of unemployment. And I think there's a really important set of questions to be asked about how the kind of jobs that would be created through a job guarantee in caring services, for example, and environmental remediation fit in with permanent employment in those sectors. And to my mind, we want to increase the quality and quantity of jobs on a permanent basis in caring services, the panoply of green jobs and so on. So I have a bit of skepticism about a job guarantee, and I see some danger of it undermining support for unemployment insurance, full employment objectives. Perhaps I'll just leave it there, Gregor. I've probably gone on long enough.
Okay, thank you, and we'll get you to come back, Andrew. We have these incredibly disciplined, and you can take advantage of this with all abandon, Jim Stanford. Just an icebreaker, first of all. Jim, you were fast out of the gate in saying we need to think very seriously about the impact of COVID and the set of opportunities and risks that it presents for working people, and then the way we think about policies for working people. And I just wonder if you can tell people about that. It's in your bio, but I think that it's an important first step of seeing COVID as both an opportunity and a risk, a clear risk, but also opportunities. Or is it just danger?
No, there's absolutely opportunities, and depending on where you are in the world, we're actually already seizing some of those opportunities. So, one of the things we did through our Center for Future Work earlier in the pandemic was a list of 10 ways that work has to change for good after COVID. And for good was meant in both senses of the term, for better, obviously, but also permanently change it for good, because the pandemic has, highlighted fissures and fractures in the labor market and the way it was operating, and forced people to say, no, we have to change these things. And if I look at that list of 10 things, I can see 3 or 4 where we've made significant progress in Canada already. And as you and Andrew were just discussing, it's not guaranteed yet, and we got to nail it down and make sure it doesn't get reversed as soon as the debt hawks come along, waving their arms about the debt wall and austerity, et cetera, et cetera. But we have made some, I think, important progress in concrete policies and even more deeply in people's attitudes to work. And in this regard, I'm just 100% aligned with the authors of the manifesto who have used that as the exact same starting point. I couldn't agree more with that.
And just those 3 or 4, Jim, what are you referring to where you think significant progress has been made, at least in Canada? And you're also based in Australia, so it could be in Australia, though that might be less the case. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it is less the case in Australia than in Canada, but there have been some, I think, important changes there as well. And in Canada, obviously, the huge progress we made on trying to fix the income security system, and again, this is still contested, that this is still in play. But there has been a sudden recognition that the former safety net was not worth the paper it was printed on. It was so full of holes, and the government had to move quickly to get people some income support. Recognition of the dangers, the broader social and economic and health dangers of precarious work. The fact that you have millions of people going around without something basic like paid sick leave. Well, how on earth are they going to stay home in response to a public health order because they might have had contact with someone with COVID if they're going to lose all their income by doing so? That just isn't going to work. So already, again, movement on the policy front in that regard. Some of the occupational health and safety issues related to COVID being addressed in, again, varying ways, and we're still not there yet. But I think those are all pieces of evidence to show that phrase the arguments right, tap into Canadians' newfound appreciation of the value of essential work in all ways. And again, this is where the authors of the manifesto were absolutely bang on. And then mobilize political pressure to make it happen. That last part is essential. It's never going to just come down to us in some kind of technocratic way because, illuminated officials in government said, oh, wow, that's right, we do need to have paid sick leave, right? It's going to happen because we fight for it and win it. And but in all those areas, even though this is a terrible, terrible time, I do have a little bit of optimism about our opportunities to make some positive gains through it.
So let's tilt now to the actual manifesto and how you pick up on the manifesto, its core arguments, the kind of engaged constructive critical comments that you might want to make, and how might it be taken forward?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, first, again, I'm just thrilled to see people in other parts of the world thinking in exactly the same lines. I almost feel like, I'm part of an international revolution once again, which is just, marvelous.
You always have been, Jim. It's just that not everyone else knew.
I thought, first of all, again, as I mentioned, the way the manifesto recognizes and ratifies the nature of essential work in all of its forms. You know, in Canada, I don't know if this happened in France and Europe, we had a tradition at 7 o'clock, we'd go out on the balcony and applaud the healthcare workers and bang pots and so on, because people recognized how important that was. So that's a no-brainer. But we've also recognized the essential services that are performed by other workers who are keeping us alive. The grocery store clerks who had to go on strike in Newfoundland, as Lana reported, and the gig workers delivering food to our door, and the cleaners keeping buildings safe. And I think there's an opportunity, and the manifesto seizes that opportunity to try and shift how people view that work. And ultimately, all work is essential because the economy would stop without labor. So, you know, in a way, we've got a very subversive opportunity here, I think, to stretch how people view work and understand it. I also love the ways the manifesto went at different levels of democratizing work. You know, the workplace democracy side of it, the works councils, the representation, the unions and collective bargaining is in a way kind of the most obvious dimension in terms of having input to how the immediate workplace is. And that's where the analogy to a government and democracy and so on is obvious. But the manifesto also talks about de-commodifying work in the sense of challenging what kind of work we do. What is the purpose of our work? What is our work going to be used for? And that's in a way a kind of meso level of taking on democratization. And then, of course, the demand to ensure full employment, which I would argue is an extension of democratic struggle to the macroeconomic level, to say we have to have control over how our work is organized and compensated and planned, including at the economic level. And that is so important because one drawback to focusing at the workplace level is if we limit our goals for democratization to giving workers more say, more input, more ability to influence firm level decisions, whether that's the choice of the CEO or whatever particular corporate strategy is being embarked on. Democratization will always be constrained within the box of the competitive market system that those firms are operating in. And, you know, for that reason, I think we always have to be thinking about how do workers in a collective sense have control over how work occurs, not just input into the decisions of their particular firm, because part of our strategy is going to be, in a way, to get beyond that system of market-based competition that pits worker against worker. No matter how much influence I have at the boardroom table, if I'm still dealing with one company that has to fight for survival in a globalized competitive environment, my ability to actually influence how work changes is going to be limited. We've seen that over and over again through the union movement. You know, the companies always invite the workers in to give their input whenever the companies are in trouble, because they want the workers to start to identify with the challenges of the company and give helpful suggestions, and also get ready to tighten their own belts as part of the solution. And, you know, my former president, Buzz Hargrove, used to laugh and say, every time the company says, here, I'll show you the books, come and take a look, he leaves the room and walks the other way because he doesn't want to see the books at that particular point in time. And we had a horrible example of that in Canada this year with another of Lana's very brave groups in Saskatchewan, a group of workers who were on strike for months against a co-op. It was a consumer co-op, not a worker co-op, but it was a democratically run firm, not really, but at one level, that was trying to screw the workers just like any other oil refinery would. So there's, I think, a bit of a warning. For that reason, one bit of feedback to the authors, I'm not comfortable with that term labor investor. I think for that reason, I understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to say that these companies couldn't operate without what workers are bringing to the equation, if you like. And I think that's fine, but by calling it an investor, first of all, I think it gives too much legitimacy to the idea of investment in a sort of more financial or cumulative sense of the word. And I think it does unnaturally constrain our goal to what it is that the company itself is doing, as opposed to what we as society are doing. And our ultimate contribution as workers is our brains and our brawn to produce the goods and services that we need to survive and thrive. And I'm not sure that I would call that an investment. At least in the sense that the term is used conventionally in economics. A couple of other bits of input where I'm echoing very much what Lana and Andrew have already said. I think unions have to be put front and center. You know, the manifesto talks about works councils and how to those, and some of the other opportunities for mechanisms and structures of voice and democratization, and I'm really interested in that. But unions are one way to partially democratize a workplace, and I think they should be front and center in that whole discussion. And then I'll echo Andrew's concerns about the use of the term job guarantee. It could be a question of how we're translating terms from one language to another and one political context to another. But in North America, job guarantee is, I think, quite closely, that term is quite closely, perhaps unjustly, associated with that particular modern monetary theory approach that has a lot of issues and a lot of problems, in my judgment. I would just prefer to call it full employment. And there's all kinds of ways to get to full employment, including a role for direct government hiring in kind of make work type community service environmental remediation projects. I'm not opposed to that at all, but I wouldn't see that particular model of job creation as the magic bullet here. It would be one of many elements in a broader portfolio of progressive, expansionary, full employment, sustainable economic policies. So those would be my bits of feedback, but on the whole, I love where you're going with this, and so thrilled to see others thinking the same way.
Thank you very much, Jim. A great set of comments. We're going to get some reaction from Julie and Isabelle on some of the comments, and I don't think that we want to get into all of the thicket of details in the sense that there are things that they raised. I think that we want you to identify what you feel are some of the most important comments and the ones that you want to take forward. And of course, behind that is what is to be done. The kind of question that says, okay, where do we go from here? I also want to highlight that we continue to have the chat function, and Esteban has already beautifully answered a question asked by Tony Dundon, and some we can pull up, and others we'll see how we go. We have about another 15-20 minutes, okay, for the time that we have today. We went a little over time yesterday, and we could again, but we don't want to exaggerate people's screen time given all the other constraints in their lives. So, and may I just remind you that this is co-sponsored by the Polanyi Institute. So read De-commodification, absolutely, but much more, by Industry 4.0 Work and Employment of OVIA, a research initiative here in Quebec, and therefore it's largely about digital transformations and the governance or lack of governance of those transformations, and about from the CRIMT partnership on experimentation for better work, and that links quite closely with some of the things that have been said, because it's making the argument that if you want to have better work, we're engaged in a prolonged period of experimentation from which we need to draw lessons systematically and see how we engage in the struggles, as epitomized by Andrew's comments on how you actually move these things forward. I think that Lana was also making this point. So over to you, Julie, to start. And if you want it to be Isabelle, both of your microphones are currently off. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Gregor. So let me first start by thanking Lana, Esteban, Andrew, and Jim. We're very grateful that you engaged in the way you did and shared your comments and reactions. All the more grateful as what we're looking forward to doing is collaborating with you and others who are part of this much broader movement that we're all a part of. So just a few reactions to what you said, and I'm mostly now processing and thinking about the implications, and the comments could not be more timely, because who knows if there is indeed an English version of the book. We have to be thinking very carefully about what we're going to put emphasis on and how we engage people in that conversation, not only in Europe and other continents, but also here critically in North America. So Lana, Esteban, Jim, the points you made on the importance of unions, as well as cooperatives, are not only well taken, but what we want us to know is that to us, the inspiration for the work has come from the work of unions, the works of cooperatives. So if I think about what led me to actually meet Isabelle, it's the studies I had been conducted on social enterprises on the one hand, on cooperatives on the other hand, and it's this kind of work that has led me to think about democratization, and that's how Isabel and I really started working together and exchanging. So it's clear to us that we need to go deeper and think much more about the connections and implications as we think about democratization and what's happening today, and thinking about democratization and like the role of the unions that has been so critical and that will continue to be critical as we think about some of the changes that Isabel mentioned in terms of thinking about who's going to be represented and where is it going to be on the board, is it going to be 2 chambers, but all of that will have to happen not only with the input of unions, but with the unions deeply involved. And so we look forward to more conversation on that and working with you and many others on those questions. For cooperatives, I would say the same. Like whenever I talk about the manifesto now across the world, thanks to the virtual technology, I get a lot of questions from people saying, hey, I know what you're saying about shareholders and them concentrating power is true, but let's talk more about much smaller businesses. Let's talk more about people launching their own organizations. Let's talk more about cooperatives. And I think it's, again, point well taken. We have to do that. We have not put enough emphasis on that dimension, I think, in the work we've been doing up until now. And then I want to go back to Jim's and Andrew's critical point on this notion of the job guarantee and full employment. And I will let Isabel respond on the labor investors, because I know this is core and central to her thinking and the work she's been doing. But on full employment, thank you for making the points you made, because you're so right to say this job guarantee, we're not thinking of that as a panacea. It's not like the magic bullet, as you said, Jim, that's going to solve all the issues. And Andrew, you were so right to sort of ask us and everyone to be careful as we think about that job guarantee and what it means. So I heard you point on, is it the right label? And we have to be thinking very carefully about that in especially the North American context. But then what's critical to us, and it's a conversation that I've been having a lot with Pavlina Chernova, is that over the past decades, we've learned a number of things about things that work in terms of labor policy, right? And we're not saying that what we're proposing now should come and replace these things. We should be thinking about this intervention as a complement. And the right question is, what's the right complement so that we can help get to this situation of full employment that, Jim, you were describing. And I think that's what we have to be thinking more about. If I think about existing mechanisms, obviously different countries have different policies in place, but there's also an organizational form, the social enterprises, like the work integration social enterprises that exist in a number of countries. I know they exist in Canada, they exist in the US, they exist in Europe, they exist in France. Those are organizations I've studied extensively. And so I know firsthand how difficult their work is and how important it's been in certain contexts. So as we think about the job guarantee, we have to think about how it's going to complement the work of these organizations as well as the work of governments. And again, thanks again, because we also have to be thinking about the label we're using.
Thank you, Julie. Over to you, Isabel, for some reactions. And then, again, we have the chat, though some of it is able to answer questions on the chat or making comments. And we also will invite comments from Lana, Esteban, Andrew, and Jim in reaction to what others have said as well, as opposed to just directing it to the manifesto. So go ahead, Isabel.
Thank you. Well, so much food for thought and so much great points that you're making that obviously I have to make a choice, and it's very frustrating, but let me make maybe 4 points. The first one, I love the way Lana summarized the stakes, saying that there's never been a transition affecting workers as a whole that has been just in history, in the economic history. And so let's be very mindful that this is actually what we are sort of envisioning is actually very hopeful, and we know reality is dark. And so these principles obviously need to be taken, like if we want to make them real, make them effective, it's gonna require lots of mobilization, social mobilization, mobilization by actors. This is the writing a book is easy compared to obviously the work of making real changes. And here, obviously, unions are absolutely central to that history any gains that have been made in the past history, but any gains that are going to be made in the future will involve the sheer energy that unions are going to put in these struggles. So this is meant to recognize that, obviously, I think in our understanding, unions are absolutely a key social actor, but at the same time, we're very mindful that depending on context, they have different types of strength, and so we can only I'm getting lots of energy from this discussion, seeing how fired up you are, and I can only be hopeful that with this kind of engagement with these ideas, indeed, the labor movement can actually achieve a big impact on this coming transition. Now, in terms of how to call workers precisely, I understand that unions certainly have a real legitimate claim in paying attention to how they are themselves calling and identifying workers. And the term labor investors, I understand, is controversial. But maybe here we are more ambitious than you are, in the sense that, as you know, Gramsci said, you need to reclaim the legitimacy of words, pay attention to the words that we are using, so that you're not doomed into just the very simple act of speaking, choosing words that maybe belong to an opposite worldviews, the view that you want to fight against. And I understand this is how you understand the resonance of labor investors, but precisely the term is there to highlight the fact that we are so much immersed in a world which has normalized the term investor for people bringing money to an economic endeavor. And money actually is only something that is external to the person. It has nothing personal. And the real investor, the person, the one who invests, who puts himself, herself in, is actually the worker. That's her who is putting her whole energy, her brain, her physical health, her mental health in the job, in the service, and that's actually not the money bringer to the endeavor. So I think here the point of using the term labor investors is actually to try to reverse the hierarchy of legitimacy and actually reclaim the idea that the real investment in the world is made by workers, not by those who are bringing money, even though that's important, obviously, but that's absolutely not up to what workers are bringing to their work. Last point maybe on the magic bullets. Obviously, there are no magic bullets. And on the job guarantee, I really invite you to read Pavlina Cherneva's work. That's a groundbreaking book. And it addresses many of what the criticism, the critiques Andrew raised, and I understand. I understand the fair points that are in there, but I think you might be convinced by reading her book.
Okay, thank you, Isabel. Now we're heading towards the end. I want to make a comment or relay a comment coming from Bill Taylor, and maybe you can pick it up, which is coming from Hong Kong. Some of this seems like a global North discussion and not a global South discussion, and we haven't brought that into the equation. Yesterday, Adele Blackett did so very eloquently and notably in relation to what we call the angels in Quebec, i.e. the people who are here illegally and performing work as essential service workers, and lo and behold, they don't come from the global north, and usually they have a color and often a gender as well. Just a parting comment from Lana, from Esteban, from Andrew, Jim, in any particular order of something that you think we should pick up on or want to relay.
Well, a couple of things, if I may just jump in. I hope that my comments weren't construed with an overly northern bias. I mean, I come from an immigrant family. My family comes from the Caribbean, actually, and a super majority of our members are people. A lot of our members are. Many of them don't even speak English as a first language or at all. Many of them are monolingual, especially from Central America, parts of the Caribbean, and South America. And I was trying to indicate explicitly that the work that we're doing is international, in part through my work with CICOPA America. CICOPA is the International Worker Co-Federation, and globally, CICOPA itself includes representatives from everywhere from Japan throughout Latin America, North America, Europe, and nowadays even other parts of Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So, I mean, the projects that we're involved in, whether it's around labor solidarity, movements for racial economic justice, post-colonial organizing, and the questions that we're asking are global questions. I mean, we're dealing with global capital, we're dealing with a global regime of neoliberal policies and ways that it has treated humans and workers in particular. So sometimes that all needs to be said very explicitly, otherwise it's interpreted to be otherwise. And that's our own sort of deprogramming that we need to do, even in engaging in conversations. Secondly, I was going to actually mention this last, but maybe I'll just say it now while we're talking about workers of color, which again are most of our workers. About 2/3 of them are not white, at least for the data that we have in the U.S. And of course, there's about 2 million members in worker cooperatives all around the world. Many of them are in places like India, et cetera. So that the last decade or so of organizing and maybe one of the few things that's been truly innovative coming from the U.S. in particular is the work that we've done to develop worker cooperatives with immigrant communities and with refugee communities. And part of our leadership there, and again, there's very few places where we're in a position of learning from everyone who's been far more advanced from all over the world. But one of the places where we're offering mentorship and models for how to organize and incorporate contingent workers and marginalized workers and often undocumented workers is around the approach to, especially working with community-based organizations, sometimes nonprofits that work with immigrant communities and refugee communities to develop worker cooperatives, in part because it provides a connection to all the different components of stability, addressing volatility, and having an economic structure to fall back on. So not just wages, not just the well-being, but having, like I was saying, access to this asset that then can be leveraged for a whole host of reasons. Our cooperatives became the first way that many of our immigrant members were able access to any sort of formal health care, dental care. Again, that's particularly the United States because, we're run by a government that doesn't believe that healthcare is a human right. And so that ends up being one of the ways that's useful for us to organize and make sure that we're taking care of folks. And I think that lastly, why that ties into the last piece of the manifesto, which I have not had a chance to speak to yet, around remediation, is because the impact of, let's just say, climate impact as one example of remediation and what needs to be repaired it's not a separate issue. It's part and parcel of what it means to address communities and working people who are not only the front lines of being essential workers and having to be in harm's way, as food workers, grocery workers, healthcare workers, transportation workers, logistics, warehousing. All of that is primarily people of color, many of whom are precarious in one way or another. But we're also on the front lines of the impacts, not in the future, but even right now, of climate change, the displacement from that, and not having the access to wealth to help us not just remediate, but help us to weather and be resilient when we're faced with displacement, when we're faced with different kinds of catastrophes, is a growing threat. So I think there's actually a way to make a direct connection between what it means to democratize work and labor and businesses, and what it means to be prepared, not only to use those businesses to do repair, but to use those businesses to make our communities more resilient, and to have the economic means to thrive. I think the last piece that I did want to mention about like just what the purpose is of a manifesto, to me, I'm interested in the pieces of this conversation that are really addressing this question of a theory of power, and thinking about who is the audience of this manifesto. Which isn't to say that this is all rhetorical. I think that what this does, what it's helpful for, is helping us to articulate what it is that we want or are envisioning, and also why we're organizing in a certain way. And I think that that becomes useful in helping us to figure out what it looks like to build up our own power, to do organizing, and to use that to confront racial capitalism in all the ways it's been devastating our communities.
Thank you, Esteban. Terrific contributions, which could easily start the third hour of our conversation. However, we need to be sensitive to. That said, comments from Andrew, Jim, or Lana as a final word from any.
I'll jump in quickly if I might. Just a quick point on the union's Works Council issue or debate. I conceive of this not as alternatives but as complements. I think often in North America, in Ontario, for example, the law mandates workplace health and safety committees. Our experience in the labor movement has been that they barely exist outside unionized environments, because it takes the union to push to have it. But at the same time, it's useful to have a statutory basis for negotiating better health and safety with an employer. My impression is in Germany, the Works Councils are much stronger than in, say, France, because the German unions utilize the powers given to them by Works Council structures by operating within those structures. So I think unions are primary, but I mean, I think there's a complementary relationship with Works Council that's important potentially. And I thought the manifesto actually quite neatly sort of describe limits on the existing structures. This is probably late in the day to raise this, but I forgot to flag one point I wanted to make, which was part of the debate around equality of work, I think, is the whole issue of redistribution of working time. I think there's a lot of evidence that new technology is polarizing the job market in terms of skills. We're producing a lot of overeducated workers relative to labor market needs. I think, reducing hours in core jobs, highly skilled jobs, is a way of expanding access to good employment. And perhaps in a bit more visionary way, now that we recognize our grocery store workers and other essential workers as heroes, maybe some of that work should be shared. And maybe a potential future is individual workers could spend part of their time in knowledge-based jobs, high productivity jobs, and maybe part of their time in occupations that don't require such high skills but are socially necessary labor.
And part of their time playing in the orchestra, I bet, Andrew. I know where you're going with this. I've heard.
That's right. Poetry in the afternoon.
And poetry, Jim.
Well, if we're going to de-commodify labor, let's dream. So.
Gregor, just a couple of points. This is a hopeful document.
Have your camera, Lana, and if you want to have your camera on.
Oh, I'm on. I can see me.
Okay.
I think it's you that probably can't. I'm down in the corner again. on my screen.
It was probably come back in a moment. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I just want to highlight 2 points because this is a hopeful document, and I think that there's so much to be built on from this. I just want to explain one example of how, because I think it speaks to the bigger power that you can have as a union in a workplace. If you're a social union and you look at the societal conditions around you and you say, okay, what can I do about this at my workplace? And most recently, we negotiated racial justice advocates during this round of auto bargaining. And their job is to work with our broader human rights department, but also to develop a racial justice action plan for these auto factories. What does this look like at work? How do we tie in legislative achievements that will be needed around equity and really giving structure to this? So I think that there are many things that we can do with the power of collective bargaining if we just open our eyes to what can be achieved there. And that really does mean having an ongoing conversation with working people and not just dictating what it is that you can do, but organizing workers over and over and over again. You can't just assume that this job is done. Secondly, on the remediation, I think we are in a moment right now where we can move this a lot faster than we probably would have thought, and it's because of the pandemic and because governments all around the world are going to have to invest in a different kind of economy. They're going to have to build the economy back up. They are going to have some kind of a jobs program in many countries around the world. And so it is an opportunity for us to talk about where that investment should go, where government dollars should go. And this is how we can, I think, push more into a green economy agenda and have governments investing in sectors to basically do this environmental remediation work that you're talking about. And this will build lots of new jobs, and they will be good jobs. And so I want to use the moment, the crisis that we're in, as awful as it is, all of us need to be able to look at where the opportunities are here as well. And I think this manifesto helps us do that. So thank you very much for your great work.
Thank you, Lana. And a last comment, Jim?
Oh, Gregor, just really quickly, I'm really glad to be participating in this discussion, and I look forward to where it goes next. I'm very keen on fleshing out that idea of how we democratize work at the macroeconomic level and what I would say a sort of full and a multi-dimensional strategy for full employment would look like that would address including the environmental end, but the human and caring services end, that would absolutely guarantee people a job, but not in the sort of workfare sense of it at all, but as part of a sort of a macroeconomic full employment commitment. I think we could do a lot of great work there. So maybe I'll circulate some materials that I'm aware of as part of carrying on that conversation afterwards. And thanks again for hosting this.
Thank you so much, Jim, and I can certainly assure you that the sponsoring organizations of this activity are all taking this on and looking for ways to take it forward, as well as, of course, the authors of the manifesto and the way that that's going to be taken forward, both with the book which has just appeared in French and the one that will be forthcoming in English. Now, you cannot imagine how frustrating it has been for Margie to not them. So over to her now to close things up.
I will just close things up because I'm looking at the time and I think we need to end. But I have to say that after 2 days, almost 3 hours of conversations about the manifesto, our agenda is full. I know your agenda is very full, Julie and Isabel and Dominique, who's not here with us. But the complementarity between these 2 days, separated by language, and for those of you who speak both languages, I really invite you to listen to the French webinar. Reveals so many important issues that we can take forward. Because yesterday most of the commentators were from Quebec-based unions, you could see, for those who are not in Quebec, the strength of the labor movement in Quebec, how solid it is, how representative it is in Quebec society, the voice that it has had, but also with respect to Esteban, comments and worker co-ops and the importance of the U.S. Federation and CICOPA, which does superb work internationally. What we've achieved in Quebec, and not fully, nothing is ever fully achieved. I mean, that's our goal. But what we have achieved is an ongoing conversation and solidarity between the cooperative movement, the social economy, solidarity economy, and the labor movement. And I think that's quite uncharacteristic. But I don't want to just, say that what we've done is perfect and right. But I do think that it's a template, really, of the alliances and the coalitions that have to be built. And I especially want to thank Andrew and Jim for bringing. I mean, I'm an economist also, and always arguing for the necessity to bring in the policy, macro policy picture, that we have to have aligned macro policies. Otherwise, the work that we're doing on the ground is important, but we don't have mechanisms that are necessary. So that work, absolutely has to be done. And yes, the reference to job guarantee is an attempt, but I had the same reaction to that. I think it's our experience with workfare that it's difficult for us. I know it's not that, but I see Isabel, nodding her head. But there is that tendency to associate the two. I won't go on. I just want to say, Julie, Isabel, Dominique, in her absence, you have inspired extraordinary, responses to your work. I've attended some of your webinars that you've organized post the appearance of the manifesto. I know that your hope is to build a movement around the manifesto that goes beyond the walls of the universities and research centers. I think you are doing that. We've tried in our modest way, Gregor and I and our colleagues, to move in that direction. So we have a lot of work to be done. Bravo for the initiative. I look forward to the book in 27 languages. Certainly the one in English, the one in French is already available. Gregor, thank you for being an absolutely superb moderator en français and in English. Really a model. And thank you all the people who have hung in here for an hour and a half. I've been seeing very few people have left, and to be continued. We will see how we can continue through our respective institutes and organizations. And then I wish you all a good day, evening, night, for those of you who can now finally go to bed. Thank you from us, and see you again. Until next time.